Well, models of things are typically mathematical models. My business for a while after I left pure mathematics was trying to model financial markets. And you develop ways of looking at the movement of stocks or commodities or one thing or another, and you see mathematical patterns of one sort or another, and you say, okay, well, we can model the stock market with these patterns. And it sheds some light on what's going on. Not as much as I'd like to shed on what's going on, but it helps. It reduces the uncertainty. Of certain things. So models are typically mathematical models, and Michael Faraday did most of the basic work in understanding the interactions between electricity and magnetism, but he didn't know much math. And it took the next guy, Maxwell, thank you. Now you can see what's happening to my head. It took the next guy, Maxwell, James Clerk Maxwell, to interpret what Faraday was doing with a real mathematical model, namely an equation, the so-called Maxwell's equations. So you can think of Faraday was the experimentalist fooling around with, gee, look what happens here when I turn up the magnetic intensity, I get more current flowing. Gee, there seems to be things that are going around in circles, whatever it was that he was showing. So he was the experimentalist, but he wasn't the model builder. Maxwell was the guy who really built the models. And similarly, probably, now Maxwell might have been wrong. He wrote down these equations, and then they really had to be tested out in the laboratory, so to speak, and say, is he really right? And the same thing will go on in biology, where an experimentalist will have some data, he'll show a mathematically inclined person, oh, I think I can make a model of this, and he'll write down some equations or whatever it is, and something in graph theory or whatever branch of mathematics is going to be convenient. And then he'll say, well, here's my model. And the experimentalist will say, good, let's try it out. Let's see if it actually predicts what happens. If it does, great. Sometimes it does, and you've made progress. Sometimes it doesn't, and well, it's back to the drawing board. And that's the interaction that will take place, I think, for years in biology as we begin to understand these processes better and can model them. They'll be mathematical type models.
Could you go into just a little bit for my benefit so I can understand a little better than I do now what a mathematical model is? You have the brain, you have some understanding of it, you want more understanding. What the model sounds to me like you're matching up elements of the brain that you're aware of. You're tracking them with some kind of system of getting signals from them, and you're attaching, you're making them data points, and you're doing mathematical manipulations that give us more information. Well, I don't quite get how the model works.
Well, I'll give you a simple example of a model that could apply to neuronal activity. So you could, you know what a matrix is? It's an array of numbers.
Outside of being a movie, I don't know.
You don't know. Who knows what a matrix is?
Oh,
okay, we got enough matrix.
You got enough. You can talk to them.
There's enough matrix knowledge out there. So, well, a matrix is a big array of numbers. Sometimes it's squared, has the same number of rows as it has columns. And the matrix I'm about to describe is a square matrix. So I say, okay, I have all these neurons. Gosh, 80 billion, okay. And some pairs are connected, and the connection has a direction. So I say, okay, I have 100 billion columns and 100 billion rows. And I want to fill in now a number at each place in this matrix. Well, there'll be a number only if neuron I is connected to neuron J. There'll be a number. Moreover, I can say, oh, I fires and hits J, so it's a positive number, it's going in this direction, and there's a particular strength in the synapse, so I'll just write down a number that corresponds to the strength of neuron I going to neuron J. Now you'll get this gigantic array of numbers. Most of them will be zero, because most neurons are not connected, neuron is not connected to every one of the neurons in the brain, a relatively small set. So it'll be mostly zeros, but it's a great big matrix. Okay, so that's a model of the connectivity of the brain. Now, what's going to be the dynamics of that? Well, you could then fire up a certain threshold in each place. Each guy, if he's going to fire, he's going to make the next guy's fire. The numbers can be negative because a neuron can be a inhibitory neuron. So it could fire in this direction and that'll dampen down. So you can see these are the pieces of a model. It's way too simple-minded to do much of a job. But on the other hand, there it is. It's a starting place for trying to analyze this big network of neurons. And
it sounds like you're saying, once you have the model, it sounds like you're saying, you could say, if this happens between these 2 points on the model, then if we do this between these 2 points on the model, this should happen, and this would be involved in this activity. So you can predict parts of the brain that might be involved. You said something the other day that was so interesting. It was related to all the things, the changes, the physical changes taking place in our brains. You talked about infants and how fast they're making, how many synapses they're creating. Well, it seemed like a fantastically large number.
Here's a statistic that I learned a few days ago. A baby in the womb, its brain is developing very rapidly. It's highly developed. It's not completely developed. It's highly developed when born already. Now, I told you how many neurons there are and how many synapses. So at a certain point in the baby's development, new synapses are being created at the rate of 40,000 per second.
Per second?
40,000 per second. And that is a true statistic told me by a woman who's an honest woman.
But then there's this thing where they have to be pruned, huh?
Well, Eric knows
Does
more
the
about
pruning
the
go on?
pruning than I do.
When does pruning stop at a certain point?
There are 2 points before we get to pruning.
Yes.
Jim made a very profound point. I recently read up on competitive sports in young people because it's really quite scary when you realize what happens in the National Football League to kids, to adults who play football. They have brain concussions repeatedly, and after a while they get severe brain injury. And you realize that with kids, this is also a possibility that actually this occurs. And until quite recently, kids were encouraged to suck it up and go back and play some more, even if they bunt their head very seriously. So that can cause really quite significant brain trauma, which you want to avoid. But similar, if not more severe brain trauma can come from social deprivation. So in this period, when you're forming all these synapses, if you don't get affection from your parents, if your parents pay no attention to you, if worse, if they abuse you, you have serious consequences for your brain. In fact, the hippocampus, this area that's involved in brain damage, is significantly smaller if you come from a very financially impoverished home. Now, one doesn't know whether this is lack of food or just the social pressure that a family is under. But 4 independent studies have shown that if a child is brought up in a highly impoverished home, its hippocampus is going to be substantially smaller. Pruning. You produce a lot of synapses because you want to make sure all cells appropriately interconnect with one another. But at about puberty, you begin to have a peeling back, a pruning of these synaptic connections. And we were talking about this. A very interesting discovery emerged just a week or two ago. It has been known that in schizophrenia, and I think this is also thought to be true for autism, there is an excessive pruning of synaptic connections. And one of the reasons schizophrenic people have difficulty, particularly with their prefrontal cortex with certain cognitive tasks, is thought to be attributable to this excessive pruning. One also knew that there are certain genes that mutations in them are specifically correlated with schizophrenia. And it turns out people have analyzed 2 of these very recently and to see what their function is. And it turns out these genes are involved in pruning. So the first time in schizophrenia that we've identified a gene with a specific function, which is really significant progress. And it's interesting that it turns out to be involved in pruning.